When I first moved into Riverside Gardens, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. The apartment complex was everything a 34-year-old single mom could hope for. Spacious 2-bedroom units, a decent school district for my 8-year-old daughter Emma, and rent that didn't completely drain my teacher's salary. The grounds were well maintained, with a small playground where Emma could make friends, and the community felt safe and welcoming. That first week, neighbors introduced themselves with genuine warmth. Mrs. Rodriguez from 2B brought over homemade cookies, while Mike from across the hall offered to help if I ever needed anything. The maintenance team was responsive, fixing a leaky faucet within hours of my request. Everything seemed almost too good to be true. Then I met Victoria Brennan, the building manager. Victoria was a woman in her early 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and an outfit that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She carried herself with the kind of confidence that immediately commanded attention, but there was something calculating in her pale blue eyes that made me slightly uncomfortable. "Welcome to Riverside Gardens," she said during our introduction, her smile bright but not reaching her eyes. "I trust you've read through your lease thoroughly. We maintain very high standards here." I nodded, mentioning how impressed I was with the community so far. "Everyone's been so friendly and helpful." "Yes, well," Victoria's tone shifted slightly. "Friendliness is one thing, but we do have rules for a reason. Order and respect for property values. That's what keeps this place desirable." She handed me a thick packet of additional regulations, much thicker than what I'd received during the signing. "These are our community guidelines. Please review them carefully. We've found that some tenants need more guidance than others." The way she said "some tenants" while looking pointedly at Emma, who was playing quietly nearby, sent a small chill down my spine. But I pushed the feeling aside, attributing it to first-day nerves and the stress of moving. "Of course," I replied. "Emma and I are just happy to have found such a nice place to call home." Victoria's smile tightened. "I'm sure you are. Just remember, Ms. Patterson, we work very hard to maintain a certain atmosphere here. I do hope you'll be a good fit." As she walked away, clicking across the courtyard in her designer heels, I couldn't shake the feeling that her words carried an underlying threat. Emma tugged at my sleeve, asking if we could check out the playground again, and I forced myself to focus on her excitement rather than my growing unease. That evening, I flipped through Victoria's additional guidelines. Most were standard. No loud music after 10 p.m., keep common areas clean, register all guests, but some seemed oddly specific and harsh. Children weren't allowed to play in the courtyard after 6 p.m., even on weekends. Any excessive noise could result in immediate lease termination. Package deliveries were restricted to specific hours, with hefty fines for violations. The language throughout was cold and punitive, very different from the welcoming atmosphere I'd experienced from my actual neighbors. It read like someone was looking for reasons to find fault rather than create a harmonious community. Still, I told myself these were just precautions. Maybe Victoria had dealt with problem tenants before and was being extra careful. I filed the papers away and focused on settling into our new home, helping Emma adjust to her new school, and preparing for the upcoming academic year. For those first few weeks, everything remained peaceful. Emma made friends with the Rodriguez children, and I began to feel genuinely optimistic about our fresh start. But I should have paid more attention to those initial warning signs, because Victoria Brennan was just getting started. The first real conflict came 3 weeks after we'd moved in, on a beautiful Saturday afternoon in early September. Emma had been playing with her friend Sophie Rodriguez on the small patch of grass near the courtyard fountain. They weren't being loud, just 2 8-year-olds engaged in an elaborate game involving her collection of toy horses and an imaginary rescue mission. I was sitting on a nearby bench, grading papers and enjoying the warm sunshine while keeping one eye on the girls. Other families were out too. Mr. Chen was tending to his small herb garden in the designated planting area, and a couple from the 3rd floor was reading together on another bench. It was exactly the kind of peaceful community afternoon I'd hoped for when choosing this place. Then Victoria appeared, striding across the courtyard with purpose. "Excuse me," she called out sharply, directing her attention to Emma and Sophie. "Girls, you need to move along. This area isn't designated for children's activities." I looked up from my papers, confused. "I'm sorry, is there a problem?" "They're just playing quietly." Victoria turned her icy gaze on me. "Ms. Patterson, as I mentioned during your orientation, we have very specific guidelines about common area usage. Children's recreational activities are restricted to the designated playground area only." "But this is just a small patch of grass," I said, trying to keep my voice reasonable. "They're not bothering anyone or damaging anything." "Rules are rules," Victoria replied curtly. "The grass areas are for aesthetic purposes and quiet adult relaxation. Children tend to be unpredictable. We can't have them treating the entire complex like their personal playground." I glanced around the courtyard. Mr. Chen was still peacefully working in his garden, and the reading couple hadn't even looked up. No one seemed bothered by the girls' quiet play. I understand having guidelines, but surely some flexibility. "There is no flexibility in maintaining property standards," Victoria interrupted. "If you can't follow basic community rules, perhaps Riverside Gardens isn't the right fit for your family." The threat was barely veiled, and I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment. Other residents had started to notice the confrontation, and I could see Sophie looking confused and slightly frightened by Victoria's harsh tone. "Emma, why don't you and Sophie go play on the playground?" I said gently, not wanting to escalate the situation further in front of my daughter. As the girls gathered their toys and headed toward the play area, Victoria wasn't finished. "I trust this won't happen again, Ms. Patterson. We have standards to maintain, and I won't hesitate to document patterns of rule violations." She walked away without another word, leaving me sitting there feeling humiliated and angry. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had witnessed the entire exchange from her patio, came over looking troubled. "Don't let her get to you, Maija," she said quietly. "Victoria's been getting worse lately. More controlling, more nitpicky. My husband thinks she's trying to push out families with children to attract wealthier tenants." "Can she actually do that?" I asked, my stomach sinking. "If she documents enough violations, she can make life very difficult," Mrs. Rodriguez admitted. "We've seen it happen before. Good families forced to move because she made living here unbearable." That evening, I carefully reread my lease and Victoria's additional guidelines, looking for any mention of the grass area restrictions. While the playground was indeed designated for children's activities, there was nothing explicitly prohibiting quiet play on the grass areas. The language was vague enough that Victoria could interpret it however she chose. I also started paying closer attention to how she interacted with other residents. Victoria was all smiles and accommodation with the wealthy-looking couple in the penthouse unit, chatting pleasantly about property values and neighborhood improvements. But I noticed her tone grew colder when speaking with the Latino families, the elderly residents on fixed incomes, and anyone with children. The pattern was becoming clear, and it made my blood boil. Victoria wasn't just enforcing rules. She was selectively targeting certain residents while treating others like valued customers. And apparently, as a single mother and public school teacher, Emma and I had been placed firmly in the undesirable category. I tried to shake off the incident and focus on settling into our routine, but Victoria's threat echoed in my mind. Document patterns of rule violations. It sounded like she was building a case against us before we'd even had a chance to prove ourselves as good neighbors. Little did I know, that Saturday afternoon confrontation was just the opening move in what would become an increasingly hostile campaign designed to make our lives at Riverside Gardens as difficult as possible. Over the next month, Victoria's scrutiny intensified in ways that seemed almost comically petty, if they weren't so frustrating. Every few days brought a new complaint, a new violation, or a new interpretation of the building rules that seemed designed specifically to target Emma and me. The first was a formal written notice about excessive noise during quiet hours. The alleged violation: Emma had been coughing during a mild cold at 10:30 p.m. on a Wednesday night. According to Victoria's complaint, filed with timestamp precision, the coughing had disturbed the peaceful enjoyment of neighboring units. When I pointed out that my daughter was sick and that coughing wasn't exactly optional, Victoria responded with a thin smile and a suggestion that I consider finding accommodations more suitable for families with health issues. Then came the parking violations. Our assigned spot was clearly marked as 2A, but Victoria began leaving notes on my windshield claiming I was encroaching on common driveway space. I measured the distance from my bumper to the painted line. I was well within the boundaries. When I brought photos to prove this, Victoria dismissed them as irrelevant and stated that her visual assessment was sufficient documentation. The mail situation was perhaps the most ridiculous. Victoria implemented a new policy requiring all package deliveries to be personally received during a narrow 3-hour window on weekdays, conveniently during school hours when I was at work. Any packages left unattended would be confiscated and held for a $25 storage fee per day. When I explained that as a teacher, I couldn't leave work to sign for routine deliveries, Victoria suggested I prioritize my residential obligations. But it was the playground incident that really showed how far Victoria was willing to go. Emma had been playing with 3 other children from the complex after school one Thursday. They were having a wonderful time on the swings and slides, their laughter carrying across the courtyard. I was sitting nearby, working on lesson plans and enjoying watching my daughter truly happy and settled in our new community. Around 5:45 p.m., Victoria emerged from the management office and marched over to the playground with a clipboard in hand. "I'm sorry, children, but playground hours end at 5:30 p.m. on weekdays," she announced loudly. "You'll need to return to your units immediately." The kids stopped playing, looking confused. Emma climbed down from the monkey bars and approached me. "Mom, is that a real rule?" I had memorized every guideline by now, and there was no mention of specific playground hours. "Victoria, could you point me to where that policy is written? I don't recall seeing it in any of the documentation." "It's part of our noise ordinance," she replied curtly. "Children's activities must cease by 5:30 to ensure peaceful evening hours for all residents." "But it's barely evening and they're not being loud," I protested. "They're just playing normally." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Ms. Patterson, this is now the 4th documented incident of your family failing to comply with community standards. I'm beginning to question whether you're capable of living harmoniously in a managed property environment." That phrase, managed property environment, hit me like a slap. The condescension was unmistakable, as if she was speaking to someone too ignorant to understand basic social contracts. "I think there's been a misunderstanding about several of these so-called violations," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite my growing anger. "Perhaps we could schedule a meeting to review the actual policies versus these interpretations." "There's nothing to review," Victoria replied dismissively. "My job is to maintain order and property values. Your job is to follow the rules. If that's too difficult, I'm sure you can find more accommodating arrangements elsewhere." As the other children reluctantly left the playground, their parents shooting sympathetic but nervous glances in my direction, I realized Victoria wasn't just being unreasonably strict. She was systematically building a paper trail to force us out. Every minor incident, every subjective interpretation, every harsh enforcement was being documented to create a pattern of problematic behavior. That evening, I called the property management company's main office, thinking surely Victoria's supervisors would be interested in hearing about her discriminatory enforcement practices. The woman who answered was polite but ultimately unhelpful. "Ms. Brennan has been our most effective property manager for over 3 years," she explained. "Her properties consistently maintain high occupancy rates and excellent condition. If she's documenting policy violations, I'm sure she has good reason. When I tried to explain the selective enforcement and seemingly arbitrary rule interpretations, the response was a generic suggestion to work together to find mutually acceptable solutions. It was clear that from a corporate perspective, Victoria's methods were producing the desired results. High rent payments from compliant tenants and quick turnover of anyone who might lower property values. After hanging up, I sat at my kitchen table feeling more frustrated than I'd been since my divorce 2 years earlier. Emma was doing her homework at the same table, occasionally looking up with concerned glances. She was smart enough to sense the tension, even if she didn't fully understand its source. "Mom, are we going to have to move again?" she asked quietly. The question broke my heart. Emma had already been through so much upheaval, and she was finally starting to thrive here. She'd made friends, settled into a good school routine, and felt safe in our little apartment. The thought of uprooting her again because of one woman's power trip made me furious. "No, sweetheart," I said firmly. "We're not going anywhere. This is our home." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure how I was going to make that promise a reality. Victoria clearly had the upper hand, the support of corporate management, and a systematic approach to making our lives miserable. I was just one single mom trying to provide stability for my daughter while working a demanding job that barely covered our expenses. What I didn't know yet was that Victoria was about to make a critical error, one that would finally give me the leverage I needed to fight back. The final straw came on a cold Friday evening in mid-October. During the first parent-teacher conferences of the school year, I had arranged to meet with Emma's teachers after work, which meant I wouldn't be home until nearly 8 p.m. Emma was staying with Mrs. Rodriguez for the evening, an arrangement that had worked perfectly several times before. The conferences went well. Emma's teachers were full of praise for her academic progress and social adjustment. For the first time in weeks, I felt genuinely optimistic about something. My daughter was thriving despite our housing stress, and that gave me strength to keep fighting Victoria's increasingly aggressive tactics. But when I pulled into the Riverside Gardens parking lot that evening, my heart sank. There was a bright orange notice taped to our apartment door, visible even from across the courtyard. As I got closer, I could see it was an official notice of lease violation form, the most serious type of documentation Victoria could file. The notice was dated just 2 hours earlier and claimed that Emma had been engaging in unsupervised disruptive behavior in common areas during my absence. According to Victoria's report, my daughter had been running uncontrolled through the courtyard, screaming and disturbing other residents at approximately 6:15 p.m. I stared at the paper in disbelief. Emma had been with Mrs. Rodriguez all evening, safely inside their apartment doing homework and watching a movie. There was absolutely no way she could have been causing any disturbance in the courtyard. I immediately went to the Rodriguez apartment to confirm what I already knew. Mrs. Rodriguez opened the door with a worried expression. "Jenna, I saw Victoria posting that notice," she said before I could even speak. "Emma hasn't left our apartment since you dropped her off. She's been doing her math homework at our kitchen table for the past 2 hours. Emma appeared behind Mrs. Rodriguez, looking confused and slightly frightened. "Mom, what's wrong?" Mrs. Rodriguez said someone said I was being bad, but I've been here the whole time. My hands were literally shaking with rage. Victoria hadn't just made an error or exaggerated a minor incident. She had fabricated an entire violation. She was now creating false documentation to build her case against us. "Can you write down exactly what time Emma arrived and what she's been doing?" I asked Mrs. Rodriguez. "I think I'm going to need witness statements." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded grimly. "Of course. And Jenna, this isn't the first time Victoria has filed false complaints. My husband heard her bragging to that property investor who visits sometimes about how she's cleaned up the tenant quality by encouraging certain families to relocate. That phrase, encouraging certain families to relocate, confirmed what I'd suspected all along. Victoria wasn't just being a strict manager. She was systematically pushing out residents she deemed undesirable to make room for higher-paying tenants. I spent the weekend researching tenant rights laws and documenting every interaction I'd had with Victoria. What I discovered was both infuriating and empowering. Not only were many of her tactics legally questionable, but fabricating lease violations could constitute harassment and potentially fraud. Monday morning, I requested a formal meeting with Victoria to dispute the false violation notice. She agreed to see me that afternoon, probably expecting another opportunity to intimidate me into compliance. I walked into her office armed with printed photos showing timestamps, witness statements from Mrs. Rodriguez, and copies of my research on tenant rights laws. Victoria sat behind her imposing desk, that familiar cold smile playing at her lips. "Ms. Patterson, I trust you're here to discuss your ongoing compliance issues." "Actually, I'm here to discuss your documentation practices," I replied, placing my evidence folder on her desk. "Specifically, how you filed a violation notice claiming my daughter was disrupting the courtyard at a time when she was provably in another unit with a reliable witness." Victoria's expression didn't change, but I caught a brief flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "I document what I observe, Ms. Patterson. If you believe there's been an error—" "There was no error," I interrupted. "There was a deliberate fabrication. My daughter was not in the courtyard that evening, period. I have a witness statement confirming she was inside Mrs. Rodriguez's apartment from 5:30 p.m. until I picked her up at 8:15 p.m. I opened the folder and placed the witness statement on her desk. Victoria glanced at it briefly, then pushed it back toward me with a dismissive gesture. "One resident's word against professional management observation," she said coolly. "I'm afraid that's not sufficient to overturn documented violations. So you're standing by a complaint you know is false." "I'm standing by my professional assessment of the situation," Victoria replied. "Now, if this pattern of violations continues, I'll have no choice but to recommend lease termination proceedings." The threat was now explicit and unmistakable. Victoria was so confident in her position that she wasn't even bothering to maintain the pretense of fairness anymore. I gathered my papers and stood up, looking directly into her cold blue eyes. "I see. Well, thank you for clarifying your position, Victoria. This has been very educational." As I left her office, I could feel Victoria watching me with satisfaction, probably assuming she'd finally broken my resistance. She had no idea that her refusal to acknowledge the obviously false violation had just given me exactly what I needed to take this fight to the next level. That evening, I sat down at my computer and began composing carefully worded emails to several very important people. It was time to call in some favors of my own and show Victoria Brennan that she'd seriously underestimated exactly who she was dealing with. The next phase of my plan required patience and careful documentation. Two things I'd learned to master during my years as a middle school teacher dealing with difficult administrators. If Victoria wanted to play the documentation game, I'd show her how it was really done. First, I reached out to my friend Marcus, who worked as a paralegal at a firm specializing in housing discrimination cases. We'd maintained our friendship since college, and when I explained the situation, he was immediately interested. "Jenna, what you're describing sounds like classic discriminatory enforcement," he said during our coffee meeting that Tuesday. "Selective rule application, fabricated violations, targeting families with children. It's textbook harassment designed to force out protected classes." Marcus helped me understand my legal options and, more importantly, how to properly document everything going forward. He gave me a small digital recorder and showed me how to create detailed incident logs that would hold up under scrutiny. "The key is building an undeniable pattern," he explained. "One incident can be dismissed as a misunderstanding. 5 documented incidents with witnesses and evidence. That's a case." I also started connecting with other residents who had experienced Victoria's targeting. Mrs. Rodriguez introduced me to the Johnsons, an elderly couple on fixed income who had been receiving increasingly aggressive notices about minor maintenance issues in their unit. Mr. Kim from the second floor had been battling parking violation claims despite having proof of his assigned spot. Most revealing was my conversation with Sandra Mitchell, a single mother who had moved out just 3 months earlier. She kept quiet about her experience until now, but Victoria's tactics had forced her family from an apartment they'd loved. It started with noise complaints about my twin boys, Sandra told me over the phone. Then suddenly every little thing became a violation. The final straw was when she claimed I hadn't paid rent on time, even though I had my bank records proving the payment went through 2 days early. Sandra agreed to provide a written statement about her experience, adding crucial context to the pattern of behavior I was documenting. The breakthrough came when Mr. Chen, the quiet gentleman who tended the herb garden, approached me hesitantly after witnessing another of Victoria's confrontations. "I usually keep to myself," he said in his soft voice, "but I feel bad watching what's happening to your family. Victoria doesn't know I speak English very well, so she says things around me she probably shouldn't." What Mr. Chen revealed was explosive. He'd overheard Victoria on multiple phone calls discussing her strategy to upgrade the tenant demographic by making life difficult for families with children, elderly residents, and anyone she perceived as bringing down property values. Most damaging was a conversation where she'd explicitly stated her plan to document enough violations to justify non-renewal for several specific families, including mine. She said the property management company gives bonuses for maintaining high-end tenancy. Mr. Chen explained. She was laughing about how easy it is to get rid of undesirable elements if you know how to work the system. I couldn't believe Victoria had been so careless as to discuss her discriminatory tactics where residents might overhear. But her arrogance had finally worked against her. Mr. Chen agreed to provide a statement about what he'd witnessed, though I could tell it took considerable courage for him to speak up. Meanwhile, I'd been meticulously following every building rule to the letter, making it impossible for Victoria to generate legitimate complaints. I also started discreetly recording our interactions, which proved incredibly valuable when she attempted to mischaracterize our conversations. The next confrontation came when Victoria claimed I'd been allowing Emma to play in unauthorized areas again. This time, I had time-stamped photos proving Emma had been at the designated playground during the alleged violation time, plus witness statements from 2 other parents who were present. When I presented this evidence, Victoria's response was telling. "Photography can be manipulated, Ms. Patterson. I trust my own observations over digital images." The fact that she was now claiming photos could be manipulated to dispute a minor playground location showed how desperate she was becoming to maintain her narrative of violations. I also discovered something interesting while researching Victoria's background through public records. She'd been the subject of 2 formal complaints filed with the State Housing Authority in the past 18 months, both involving claims of discriminatory treatment toward families with children. The complaints had been dismissed due to insufficient evidence, but the pattern was unmistakable. Armed with this information, I reached out to Jennifer Walsh, a reporter for the local newspaper who specialized in housing issues. Jennifer was immediately interested in the story, especially when I explained the broader pattern of targeting certain tenant demographics. "This isn't just about one family's bad experience," Jennifer said during our interview. "If property managers are systematically discriminating against protected classes to artificially inflate property values, that's a story the community needs to hear." Jennifer's investigation revealed that Riverside Gardens had seen a 40% turnover rate in family tenants over the past 2 years, while childless professionals and wealthy retirees had remained stable. The demographics shift was stark and statistically unlikely to be coincidental. But my most powerful ally turned out to be someone I'd never expected. David Brennan, Victoria's own nephew, who worked in the property management company's corporate office. David reached out to me after hearing about the situation through the workplace grapevine. I've been watching my aunt's management style for years," he admitted during our confidential phone call. "The family's always known she has strong opinions about certain types of people, but using her position to act on those opinions. That crosses a line." David couldn't directly intervene due to his family relationship and potential conflict of interest, but he provided invaluable insight into corporate structure and proper complaint procedures. More importantly, he confirmed that Victoria's bonus structure was indeed tied to maintaining desirable tenant demographics, a policy that was almost certainly illegal but had been implemented through informal understanding rather than written directives. By early November, I had assembled a comprehensive case documenting not just my family's experience, but a pattern of discriminatory enforcement affecting multiple residents. I had witness statements, recorded conversations, photographic evidence, and even inside information about corporate policies. Victoria had no idea that her systematic campaign to force us out had instead triggered the most thorough investigation of her management practices in years. She was about to learn that sometimes, when you pick on the wrong person, they don't just fight back. They fight smart. The first sign that Victoria's world was starting to crumble came during the third week of November, when Jennifer Walsh's exposé was published in the local newspaper. The headline read, "Local property manager accused of systematic discrimination against families." The article was devastating in its thoroughness. Jennifer had interviewed 6 former residents and 4 current ones, all describing similar patterns of selective enforcement and harassment. She'd obtained demographic statistics showing the unusual tenant turnover patterns, and had even managed to get a former property management employee to speak anonymously about the unwritten policies regarding tenant selection. But the most damaging element was a quote from Mr. Chen, who had overcome his natural reticence to speak publicly. "I heard her say families with children were bringing down the property values, and that she needed to encourage them to find more suitable accommodations. This is not right in America." The article also included corporate responses that were clearly crafted by lawyers, lots of language about reviewing policies, and commitment to fair housing, without actually denying any of the specific allegations. I watched from my apartment window as Victoria stormed across the courtyard that morning, newspaper in hand, her usual composed demeanor replaced by barely controlled fury. She disappeared into the management office and didn't emerge for hours. The phone in the management office rang constantly that day. I later learned from Mrs. Rodriguez, who happened to be walking past, that she could hear Victoria's raised voice through the door, apparently receiving calls from both corporate supervisors and residents demanding explanations. But Victoria's reaction to the negative publicity revealed just how determined she was to maintain control. Rather than backing down, she doubled down on her tactics with reckless aggression that would ultimately prove to be her undoing. That afternoon, every resident who had spoken to the newspaper reporter received formal notices of lease violations for various fabricated infractions. Mrs. Rodriguez was cited for excessive cooking odors that allegedly violated community standards. The Johnsons received a notice claiming their unit's heater was producing disruptive operational noise. Mr. Kim was accused of loitering in common areas for spending more than 15 minutes checking his mail. My notice claimed Emma had been engaging in disruptive vocal activities during the previous evening, a time when she had provably been at her school's fall concert with 200 other families. Victoria had included my name on the attendance roster, which the school provided to all parents. The simultaneous filing of obviously retaliatory violations was such a blatant abuse of power that even Victoria's corporate supervisors couldn't ignore it. By Thursday morning, a black sedan was parked outside the management office, and 2 serious-looking individuals in business suits spent several hours in closed-door meetings with Victoria. I learned later from David Brennan that these were investigators from both the corporate legal department and the state housing authority, who had reopened their previous complaints in light of the new evidence presented in the newspaper article. Friday brought an even more significant development. a visit from attorneys representing the Fair Housing Council, a non-profit organization that had contacted me after reading Jennifer's article. They were interested in potentially filing a federal discrimination lawsuit, and they'd brought their own investigator to document the situation firsthand. Victoria's behavior during this period became increasingly erratic. She started patrolling the courtyard at odd hours, looking for any possible violations she could document. She installed a security camera outside the management office, ostensibly for safety purposes, but positioned to monitor the playground and common areas where families gathered. Most telling was her treatment of residents she perceived as loyal. The wealthy couple in the penthouse unit suddenly received permits for previously prohibited modifications to their balcony. Long-term residents who had never spoken to reporters found their minor maintenance requests expedited with unusual efficiency. The divide-and-conquer strategy might have worked if Victoria hadn't been so obvious about it. Instead, her selective favoritism only reinforced the discrimination allegations and alienated residents who had previously remained neutral. The breaking point came when Victoria made a critical error in judgment. Frustrated by the continuing scrutiny and convinced that I was orchestrating a campaign against her, she decided to confront me directly in front of other residents. I was returning from grocery shopping on a Saturday afternoon when Victoria approached me in the parking lot, her usual professional demeanor completely abandoned. "I know what you're doing, Ms. Patterson," she said loudly enough for several nearby residents to hear clearly. "You're trying to destroy my reputation because you can't follow simple rules like a civilized adult." "I'm not sure what you mean, Victoria," I replied calmly, though my heart was racing. I could see Mrs. Rodriguez and the Johnsons watching from their patios, and I knew this confrontation was being witnessed by multiple people. "Don't play innocent," Victoria snapped. "Calling reporters, filing complaints, getting lawyers involved. All because I expect you to control your child and follow basic community standards. I've documented every interaction we've had," I said, pulling out my phone to activate the recording app. "Would you like to clarify exactly which community standards you believe I violated?" The sight of my phone seemed to inflame Victoria further. "You can't record me without permission," she shouted, reaching toward my device. "Actually, in New Jersey, I only need one-party consent for audio recordings," I replied, stepping back to maintain distance. "And this is a public area of the property." "This is harassment." Victoria's voice had risen to a near shriek. "I'm calling the police." "Please do," I said calmly. I'd welcome the opportunity to share my documentation with law enforcement. But Victoria didn't call the police. Instead, she stormed back to her office, leaving a courtyard full of residents who had witnessed her complete loss of professional composure. Several neighbors approached me afterward to express their shock at Victoria's behavior and offer their support. What Victoria didn't realize was that her public meltdown had been the final piece of evidence I needed. Her explicit admission that she was targeting me for getting lawyers involved and calling reporters was clear retaliation for exercising my legal rights. Exactly the kind of smoking gun that discrimination attorneys dream of finding. By Monday morning, Victoria Brennan's reign as the manager of Riverside Gardens was about to face its most serious challenge yet. And this time she had no one to blame but herself. The end came swiftly once the wheels were set in motion. The Monday following Victoria's public meltdown, I received a call from David Brennan informing me that his aunt had been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation by corporate headquarters. "The legal department is in full damage control mode," David explained. "Between the newspaper article, the Fair Housing Council investigation, and now witness statements about her confronting you in the parking lot, they can't afford to keep her in position." A temporary management company was brought in to run day-to-day operations while the investigation continued. The difference in atmosphere was immediately apparent. The new manager, Ms. Torres, spent her first day introducing herself to residents and asking about any concerns they wanted to address. But Victoria wasn't going down without a fight. True to form, She hired her own attorney and began claiming that she was the victim of a coordinated harassment campaign orchestrated by problematic tenants who couldn't follow basic rules. Her legal strategy quickly fell apart when the Fair Housing Council presented their findings. The investigators had documented not just the incidents involving my family, but a clear pattern of discriminatory enforcement spanning nearly 2 years. They'd also uncovered Victoria's bonus structure, which explicitly incentivized maintaining certain demographic profiles among tenants. The most damaging evidence came from Victoria's own files. During the corporate investigation, auditors discovered detailed notes in multiple tenant files documenting her personal opinions about residents' suitability for the property. These notes included comments about family composition, perceived income levels, and even ethnicity, all clearly illegal factors for housing decisions. In my file, Victoria had written, "Single mother, public employee salary, minority child likely to create disturbances. Monitor closely for lease violations to justify non-renewal." Similar comments appeared in files for the Rodriguez family, large Latino family, potential overcrowding and noise issues. The Johnsons, elderly tenants may become maintenance burden, encourage relocation to senior facility. And Sandra Mitchell, the single mother who had been forced to move. Twin boys, excessive noise complaints justified, successfully relocated. When these notes became part of the Fair Housing Council's formal complaint, Victoria's attorney quietly withdrew from the case. No competent lawyer wanted to defend explicitly discriminatory documentation in federal court. The climax came during a mandatory meeting with all residents, where the property management company's regional director, Mr. Paulson, addressed the situation directly. "We've completed our internal investigation," he announced to the packed community room. "We found clear evidence of discriminatory practices and policy violations that do not reflect our company values or legal obligations." He continued, "Effective immediately, Ms. Victoria Brennan is no longer employed by our organization. All violation notices filed during the past 6 months are being reviewed, and any that appear retaliatory or discriminatory will be removed from tenant files." The room erupted in applause, led by Mrs. Rodriguez, and quickly joined by nearly every family present. Even some of the residents, who had remained neutral throughout the conflict, seemed relieved that the toxic atmosphere was finally being addressed. Mr. Paulson also announced several policy changes designed to prevent future discrimination. Standardized enforcement procedures, mandatory training for all management staff, and an independent ombudsman system for residents to report concerns without fear of retaliation. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when Mr. Paulson addressed me directly. "Ms. Patterson, on behalf of our company, I want to apologize for the treatment you and your daughter experienced. Your courage in speaking up has helped us identify and correct serious problems that should never have been allowed to continue." After the meeting, I was approached by residents I'd barely spoken to before, all expressing gratitude for my willingness to fight back against Victoria's abuses. Some shared their own stories of minor harassment they'd endured but felt powerless to address alone. "You did what none of us had the courage to do," said Mr. Kim, shaking my hand warmly. "Thank you for making this a real community again." The legal resolution came surprisingly quickly. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a federal discrimination lawsuit, the property management company opted for a substantial settlement that included financial compensation for affected families, guaranteed lease renewals at current rates for anyone who wanted to stay, and funding for community improvements. Victoria's attempt to file a wrongful termination lawsuit lasted exactly 1 week. When her new attorney reviewed the evidence file, including her own documented discriminatory comments, he advised her that pursuing the case would likely result in additional legal liability rather than vindication. But the most telling moment came 3 weeks later, when I encountered Victoria in the parking lot of a grocery store across town. She was loading bags into an expensive SUV, dressed in the same designer clothes that had once intimidated me. When she saw me, her expressions cycled through surprise, anger, and finally something that might have been resignation. For a moment, I thought she might approach me, perhaps to argue her case one final time. Instead, she simply stared for a long moment, then got into her vehicle and drove away without a word. It was the last time I ever saw Victoria Brennan. 6 months later, Riverside Gardens had transformed into the kind of community I'd originally hoped to find. Under new management, the arbitrary rule enforcement disappeared, replaced by reasonable policies applied fairly to all residents. The constant tension that had pervaded the courtyard during Victoria's reign was replaced by the relaxed atmosphere of neighbors who actually enjoyed each other's company. Emma, now 9 and thriving in 4th grade, had become something of a celebrity among the younger children for having a mom who fought the mean lady and won. I tried to downplay that narrative, but I was proud that she'd learned an important lesson about standing up for what's right, even when it seems hopeless. The community improvements funded by the settlement included new playground equipment, better lighting in the parking areas, and a small community garden where Mr. Chen now taught interested residents about growing herbs and vegetables. Mrs. Rodriguez organized monthly potluck dinners that brought together families from different cultural backgrounds, creating friendships that transcended the superficial politeness Victoria had enforced. Perhaps most importantly, the Fair Housing Council used our case as a model for identifying and addressing subtle discrimination in property management. They developed training materials based on Victoria's tactics, helping other communities recognize and combat similar patterns of abuse. I received a letter from Sandra Mitchell, the single mother who had been forced to move during Victoria's campaign. She'd learned about the resolution through mutual friends and wanted to express her gratitude. Reading about your fight gave me the courage to file my own complaint. She wrote, "I've been awarded damages for the discriminatory treatment that forced my family from our home. More importantly, my boys now understand that sometimes you have to fight back against injustice, even when it's scary." The financial settlement had allowed me to establish a small emergency fund for the first time in years, providing Emma and me with genuine security rather than the month-to-month anxiety that had characterized our lives since my divorce. But the emotional benefits were even more significant. For Emma, the experience had demonstrated that adults who abuse their authority can be held accountable. And that speaking truth to power isn't just a phrase, it's a responsibility. She'd watched me document evidence, build coalitions, and persist through months of stress to achieve justice, lessons that would serve her well throughout her life. For me, the victory had restored faith in systems I'd begun to see as rigged against people like us. Yes, Victoria had initially held all the advantages: positional authority, corporate backing, and the presumption of credibility that comes with official titles. But when confronted with meticulous documentation and community solidarity, those advantages crumbled. The experience also taught me about the power of strategic patience. My teacher training in handling difficult administrators had prepared me well for dealing with Victoria's tactics. Rather than responding emotionally to her provocations, I'd methodically built an unassailable case that ultimately made her position indefensible. I still live at Riverside Gardens, and Emma still plays on the playground where Victoria once tried to silence children's laughter. But now she plays freely, without arbitrary time restrictions or the threat of manufactured violations hanging over our heads. The new property manager, Ms. Torres, has become not just a professional contact, but a genuine ally in maintaining the positive community atmosphere. She regularly asks for resident input on policies and treats tenant concerns as opportunities for improvement rather than attacks on her authority. Last month, I was elected to the newly formed Resident Advisory Committee, a group that works with management to address community issues before they become conflicts. It's a role that allows me to use the advocacy skills I developed during our fight with Victoria to help other families navigate housing challenges. The irony isn't lost on me that Victoria's attempt to drive us away ultimately resulted in me becoming a community leader with a platform to ensure fair treatment for all residents. Her efforts to silence criticism had instead amplified voices that had previously gone unheard. Recently, David Brennan contacted me with an update on his aunt's situation. Victoria had found a new position managing a small office building in another state, where her supervisors were reportedly very pleased with her attention to detail and rule enforcement. "I hope she learned something from what happened," David said, though his tone suggested he wasn't optimistic. "Some people never recognize that their behavior is the problem." I found myself hoping that Victoria's new tenants were prepared to advocate for themselves if history repeated itself. But that was no longer my battle to fight. Emma and I had won more than just the right to stay in our apartment. We'd proven that determined individuals armed with facts and community support could overcome institutional discrimination, even when the odds seemed impossible. As I watched Emma play with her friends in the courtyard that evening, their laughter echoing off the buildings without fear of arbitrary enforcement, I reflected on how much had changed since that first confrontation over a simple game with toy horses on the grass. Sometimes, the most important victories aren't about getting what you want. They're about ensuring that others won't have to fight the same battles you did. Victoria Brennan had tried to make our lives unbearable, but her failure had created something better. A community where fairness wasn't negotiable and where standing up for what's right was met with support rather than retaliation. That, I decided, was a legacy worth fighting for. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.